there's no way he's gonna be here. And then Clarice gets super serious and like sits down next to him and grabs his hand. He's like, listen, Jerome, I know this guy. He'll be here. So this is me on the way, and I stopped at this farmhouse and just knocked on the door, similar with Christophe and his family, and was like, c'est possible, je peux rester ici pour la nuit avec mon tante. And I was talking to this amazingly warm grandma with all of her grandchildren like scurrying around inside. And she's like, of course! Look at all this space we have! And she immediately takes me in and starts making me dinner. And she was like, why don't you just stay in the room? Why would you sleep outside? And I'm like, all right, yeah. So there's my friend Clarice and her awesome family. And me gang signing with her best friends. Okay, so now it's like August 3rd, I guess. And I need to get to Lyon. And there's this incredible site for anyone who needs to travel in this manner. As a lot of you know, train travel is really expensive in Europe. But there's this incredible site called Corbusier. And the idea is that for a little bit of extra money, people who are doing such and such rides will post up their route, say how many seats they have in their car, and the price. And so I was able to do this 6-hour trip from Tours to Lyon for 20 euro, which is like mind-blowingly low. And when I show up, I mean, I was doing this all without a phone. So I messaged the guy, I'm like, I'm in, but I don't have a phone, so you're not gonna be able to get a hold of me, but I'll be there. And I show up on the dot, on time, and there's all these guys in this tiny, like, Geo Metro-sized car. So there was 5 of us in this tiny car, and one of them looks like that giant guy from the Green Mile. He's sitting in front. And they're all super pissed with me. And I have no idea why, because I don't speak French and their details are failing me. And and I'm in the like middle seat in the back seat between these 2 enormous people, and it's like, all right, this is gonna be a good 7 hours. And I never found out why they were angry, but as we went, they seemed to warm up to me in some way, and it became a non-issue. But around like 10:30 at night, as we were 30 kilometers from Lyon, I tapped Eric, the driver, on the shoulder, and I was like, Eric, c'est possible? Vous arrêtez ici pour moi? And he like gasped, because we were in the middle of nowhere. L'Arbre is really nothing. And everyone who'd been ignoring me to this point in the trip suddenly became extremely interested in this silent Canadian in the back seat. And the guy to my immediate left, there was like, what do you mean? Like, do you know someone here? Where are you gonna stay? You have nowhere to stay. Why would you want to stop here? Do you know some friends? What are you gonna do? And the girl was actually a Quebecois Canadian, and I had her essentially tell them that I was just like, I have nothing, I'm fine, don't worry about it, just stop and let me out, and leave me here. And I was super excited, because at this point, I knew I was gonna be sleeping in a hayfield outside La Tourette, because I'd seen the photos, I'd studied it in great depth, and I knew the site plan was enormous, and I could easily get away with it, and it'd be incredible. So, all right, so the town is like way up there in the top left, and then this is the building here. So you can see all the expanse of space. And, but it was 10:30 at night, and I didn't really know the way to get there, so I ended up talking to this woman from Belgrade, and she helped show me the general direction of where to be. And eventually I got about up there where the road ends and starts coming up here. But it's pitch black because it's essentially a monk compound. So there's no light anywhere. So if you can just imagine, I'm listening to like crickets, and if any of you guys have seen the movie Signs and the parts where they're in like the cornfield, and it's super creepy just hearing the cornfields go, that's what it was like. And I've got this giant expanse of stars above my head because there's no light, so I can see a bajillion stars. And I start walking towards where I think this building might be. And I mean, essentially into darkness. And at one point, because I was attempting to avoid some lights and being illuminated, because it was very clear that I was doing something, you know, out of place in the area. So I veered off the path and wound up in this hayfield, and really, like this muddy hayfield. And I had no idea really how to get back on the path. But then I looked up and I saw this like super ominous rectilinear outline off in the distance. And I was like, hey, okay, that could be the bell tower. Oh, okay, I think I'm in the right spot. And so I pitched my tent around midnight or something with the idea that, you know what, I'm gonna wake up at first light and see if I'm in the right spot. And then I did just that, and you can see Tourette off in the distance. And when I was packing up my stuff, 2 minutes before I was gonna be walking away, the farmer of the land shows up with his brothers. And he had clearly seen my tent at some point earlier and I didn't realize it. And he's got this hilarious grin on his face, just so amused. And he's like, bon dormir? Which means like good sleep. And I'm like, wait, bon journée. And so, this is skipping ahead a bit, but I ended up, I stayed 2 nights, one night in the hayfield, another night in like the forest on the other side of the building. And like Todd Gannon was like, why didn't you just stay inside La Tourette? It's a hotel. And the thing is, the monk chamber hotels were closed while I was there because it was August. And this was the receptionist who became like my friend because I was spending so much time there over 3 days. And it was like, it was a rainy morning on my 3rd morning, and I was like, look, in French, I was like, c'est possible, je dormir avec toi pour la nuit? So I was like, is it possible for me to sleep with you tonight? But I mean, she knew what I was getting at. And I showed her the photos, and she was like, why don't you just stay in the building? And I was like, what are you talking about? It's closed, it's August. And she's like, looking at my photos, being like, this is an exceptional circumstance. So she helped me, and I actually ended up staying the 3rd night in one of the rooms, which was totally incredible. Okay. Hero shot. Second hero shot. This is a helicopter view of it, like when it was first built, because all the site was really underdeveloped. This is a facade drawing, because I'm going to start talking about the facades. I find this image really interesting because it's impossible to have this view of the facade from the ground, because this is facing a hill, and so you can imagine yourself being at the bottom of the hill, and all you really see is those. Here's a diagram of how it works. So it's essentially just a square that's been separated, and the reason he did that was to highlight the existing site axis that was created just by the slope of the hill itself. And there's some axes just to give you an idea of the basics of the project. Okay, so just like Belle Savoye, I found the facade situation in this building extremely important. So this on the left is the blank facade, and actually what's really interesting is he plays this perspectival game where the slope of that facade actually goes up about 2 feet over the life of the line. So it creates like this crazy perspectival effect that you don't realize exists until you start looking at drawings. You can see the facades. And this one's interesting because this ends up being the entry right here, which I'll talk about in a sec. But because it's such an underwhelming facade, and the way the path isn't privileged at all with the forest that's on the side, and a garden that's on the side, there are no photographs online of this thing, and I could not find one to show it to you. So just remember that when I talk about this. Okay, so on the approach route, you walk through essentially a field of trees. And at a certain point at the end of the route, about here, you catch a glimpse of this blank facade. And it's super puzzling because you don't expect the blank facade to be the front facade. But what's interesting is you look at it, you're walking, you're looking at the blank facade, sort of disregarding it, and then suddenly this view, which was obscured by the trees, just pops out of nowhere, and it's really dramatic. And the way I would read it is him creating this blank facade to work with the complement of the incredibly dramatic view, almost as a juxtaposition. So the view becomes a part of the facade. It's really fantastic. So you keep walking because you don't think that's the front facade, and you're just looking for it. And there's this very underwhelming entry experience. So you keep walking, you go through here, and then you get to this front entry threshold, and you're like, well, I mean, I guess this could be it, but I'm gonna keep walking because this doesn't seem very dramatic. So you keep walking down the path, and then you get here to the end of the building, you're like, well, okay. You end up returning to that very underwhelming entry. And it's interesting because it totally works with the building because it is a monk monastery. And it was a very humble experience being in that building. I can imagine the way he designs it. So here's a diagram of it formally, showing it horizontally and showing the juxtaposition between the verticality and the horizontality. And that becomes a really key theme throughout the entire thing. So you can just see in these images the way he uses vertical lines to contrast with very prominent horizontality. And you can see that here too. Like just using the elements to create really strong juxtaposition. And this facade's interesting because Xenakis, who ended up working with Corb on the Phillips Pavilion, helped him do this. So that's why there's so many parts, because he was really interested in the rhythms of that. And more of that stuff. Okay, now I'm going to show you the church. So there it is in plan, and these two drawings, you can see it positioned just to orient you on the left side of the axle. So the entry ends up being right there. Okay. You can just go through it. Stop on the next one. Okay, so one thing that's really interesting about this building I found was the use of the way he treats the sound in the entire structure. So you come into this church, which is essentially this giant cement cube. And closing the door upon entry created the most incredible echo one of the most incredible echoes I've ever experienced. Because it's just a solid cube, the echo is just astonishing. Like you could crumple a piece of paper and it would be extremely loud in the space. And what I find so interesting about it is he's trying to design this space of solitude and essentially an awareness of silence so that there can be contemplation. And so, I mean, the first reaction might be to create these partitionings that really divide the space and prevent sound from traveling. But instead, Corbusier does the exact opposite, and throughout the entire building, rarely uses a traditional wall. So you can see in this, if I was to speak on this side of this partition, the person on the other side of this wall would hear it perfectly fine. And so there's this incredible awareness that you start to have in your experience of the building, like staying there in the actual room. I was very aware when I was just barely running the tap water, or when I would walk down the hall to use the restroom. It was very prominent that you were imposing yourself on other people's experience, and so you should be quiet. The silence was essentially death. It was incredible. And so this is one of the kinds of partitions that Corbusier used. So if you can imagine this being floor to ceiling, this divider between space. So if I was to just stick my hand through this gap, it would have been in the hallway. So all that's separating this room from the other is this flap of wood. This is again in the church. I found this really amazing, but I can't really communicate it to you, but hopefully you feel the same way. When you go in this, the cube of the church, you have this sense of it as being this really heavy mass. And so when you see these cuts that he's done here, you feel like it's just void in a huge hunk of solid. But as you can see by the exterior, it's actually just this extrusion. So that was an ambiguity I found really notable and really interesting. It was just the way the construction happened. It was so perfect that you could swear it was just a cutout of a solid. And George is going to run through these quotes for you. I wanted to throw that one in because I found it pretty hilarious. Okay. So I was running out of time because I was flying out of Marseille a few days later, and I wanted to see the Unité. So I need to hitchhike again. Okay, so this is me. So I had this really hilarious day in Lyon where it was pouring rain, and it didn't matter how many like $5 trains I took to try and get away from the rain, it just kept following.